Marcus Chen had always believed that the most dangerous thing about working on an orbital station was the possibility of explosive decompression. He was wrong. The most dangerous thing, as he discovered while reviewing xenobiology reports in his cluttered lab, was Ambassador Lyralii walking through his door at precisely 0800 hours with what appeared to be actual sunlight radiating from her presence. Dar. Chen, I hope I'm not interrupting anything crucial, she said, her voice carrying that peculiar melodic quality that made even the most mundane diplomatic statements sound like poetry. The ornate ceremonial mask she wore, a work of art featuring intricate silver filigree and what looked suspiciously like real diamonds, caught the artificial lighting in ways that shouldn't have been physically possible. Marcus nearly dropped his coffee, which would have been a genuine tragedy considering the station's replicator had been producing what could generously be called brown liquid disappointment for the past 3 weeks. Ambassador. Not at all. Just reviewing some fascinating metabolic data from the Kepler colonies. Apparently, their wheat grows 3 times faster than Earth varieties, but tastes like cardboard soaked in regret. A sound that might have been laughter escaped from behind her mask. I've heard similar complaints about Altarian nutritional supplements. We've been trying to perfect artificial flavoring for decades, but somehow everything ends up tasting like what you humans would call purple. Purple has a taste. On Altair, everything has a taste. Our atmospheric composition includes trace amounts of flavor-enhancing particles. It's why our cuisine is so enthusiastic. Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk, carefully moving aside a precarious stack of research tablets and what appeared to be a half-assembled quantum scanner that he'd been fixing for the better part of a month. Please, sit. What brings you to the exciting world of xenobiology? Finally decided to satisfy your curiosity about those Kepler wheat samples. Lyralii settled into the chair with a grace that suggested either extensive diplomatic training or possibly some form of anti-gravity technology woven into her robes. Actually, I was hoping to discuss the upcoming interspecies cooperation protocols. The Council seems to believe that understanding biological compatibility is crucial for long-term relations between our peoples. Biological compatibility, Marcus repeated, trying not to notice how her presence seemed to make his cramped laboratory feel less like a glorified storage closet and more like somewhere important things might actually happen. That's a broad topic. Are we talking about atmospheric requirements, dietary restrictions, or the always popular, can we shake hands without anyone dying, question? All of the above, though I'm particularly interested in the handshaking protocols. I've heard human customs can be quite vigorous. Marcus demonstrated with perhaps more enthusiasm than strictly necessary, extending his hand across the desk. It's really quite simple. Firm grip, 2 to 3 shakes, maintain eye contact, try not to crush any bones. Lyralii reached out, her gloved hand meeting his. Even through the fabric, he could feel that her hand was surprisingly warm, with what felt like an extra joint in her fingers. The handshake itself was perfect. Just the right pressure, duration, and eye contact that somehow made him forget that he was looking at an ornate mask rather than an actual face. Excellent technique, she said, withdrawing her hand. Though I notice you didn't mention anything about the traditional Earth custom of commenting on the weather. Ah, you've been studying our cultural databases. Well, the weather on Harmony Station is consistently climate-controlled, artificially lit, and occasionally punctuated by the gentle hum of life support systems that may or may not be plotting our demise. Plotting our demise? Last week the atmospheric recycling system started playing what I can only describe as ambient jazz at 3 in the morning. Chief Engineer Rodriguez swears it was a malfunction, but I suspect the station's AI is developing artistic aspirations. This time the sound from behind her mask was definitely laughter, rich and genuine. On Altair, our environmental systems sing traditional ballads. It's considered quite soothing, though visitors often find it overwhelming. Imagine trying to concentrate on important work while your walls are performing epic poetry about the migration patterns of crystalline butterflies. Crystalline butterflies. Beautiful creatures. They migrate through our upper atmosphere every 73 days, leaving trails of bioluminescent particles that our ancestors used for navigation. Of course, that was before we developed proper stellar cartography, but the butterflies don't seem to mind that they're technically obsolete. Marcus found himself leaning forward, genuinely fascinated. Do they serve any ecological function, or are they purely decorative at this point? They pollinate the floating gardens that produce our atmospheric processors' organic components. Quite essential, actually, though they have an unfortunate tendency to get confused by artificial lighting. During our first attempts at interstellar communication, we accidentally attracted an entire swarm to our transmission arrays. The resulting interference made it sound like we were trying to communicate through interpretive dance. Were you? Only partially. The conversation continued for what Marcus would later realize was nearly 2 hours, covering topics ranging from the theoretical applications of bioluminescent technology to the practical challenges of maintaining diplomatic relations when half the species involved communicated primarily through scent. Lyralii proved to be not only knowledgeable about xenobiology but also possessed of a wit that kept him constantly off balance in the most delightful way possible. "I should probably let you return to your work," she said eventually, rising from her chair with that same impossible grace. "The council has scheduled another meeting about atmospheric compatibility standards, and I suspect they'll want detailed notes about human respiratory requirements. Feel free to tell them we're remarkably adaptable, generally non-toxic, and only occasionally explosive under pressure." "Only occasionally?" "Well, you haven't seen Rodriguez when the coffee replicator breaks down." As she moved toward the door, Marcus felt a peculiar reluctance to let the conversation end. "Ambassador, if you have any other questions about human biology or customs, please don't hesitate to ask. I mean, it's not like I'm making groundbreaking discoveries in here. Yesterday's big achievement was successfully identifying why the algae samples from Sector 7 were glowing purple." "Why were they glowing purple?" "Turns out someone spilled Altarian nutritional supplement on them. Everything tastes like purple," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice even through the mask. "Thank you, Dr. Chen. I suspect we'll be speaking again soon." After she left, Marcus sat staring at his computer screen for a full 10 minutes before realizing he'd been reading the same sentence about metabolic rates without actually processing a single word. Something about Ambassador Lyralii was thoroughly distracting, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Perhaps it was the way she seemed genuinely interested in everything he said, or the fact that her laugh could apparently make even his disastrous laboratory feel like somewhere worth being. He was still contemplating this when his communication terminal chimed with an incoming message from Chief Engineer Rodriguez. "Chen, your new diplomatic friend left something behind. Looks like a data pad. Want me to return it, or should I just add it to the station's growing collection of mysterious alien artifacts?" Marcus was out of his chair and halfway to the engineering section before he'd consciously decided to retrieve the data pad himself. After all, it was only proper diplomatic protocol to ensure the safe return of official documents. The fact that it provided an excuse to seek out Ambassador Lyralii again was purely coincidental. At least, that's what he told himself as he hurried through the corridors of Harmony Station, past the observation lounges where other diplomats conducted their carefully formal meetings, toward what promised to be another conversation that would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about interspecies relations. Finding Ambassador Lyralii proved more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. The diplomatic quarters were a maze of identical corridors, each marked with symbols that his universal translator insisted were either room numbers or possibly recipes for something called essence of temporal displacement. He was beginning to suspect that the station's designers had been either extremely security conscious or under the influence of hallucinogenic gases when they'd planned the layout. "Lost, Dr. Chen?" The voice came from behind him, tinged with that familiar musical quality that had been occupying an embarrassing amount of his thoughts for the past hour. Marcus turned to find Lyralii approaching from a side corridor, her ornate mask catching the light in a way that seemed to create its own small aurora. "Ambassador. I was just, well, attempting to navigate what appears to be a deliberate effort to confuse anyone who isn't a professional diplomat." The quarters were designed by a committee of Centaurian architects. They consider straight lines to be aesthetically offensive and psychologically damaging. Every corridor must curve at least 17 times before reaching its destination. 17 times. That seems oddly specific. Centaurians are very precise about their neuroses. They also insist that all furniture must be able to serve at least 4 different functions, which is why my desk can also operate as a communication array, a hydroponic garden, and apparently a musical instrument. Marcus held up the data pad Rodriguez had retrieved. You left this in my lab. I thought you might need it for your atmospheric compatibility research. Lyraliai's posture shifted in a way that suggested surprise, though the mask made it impossible to read her expression. Thank you. I've been wondering where that disappeared to. It contains my personal notes about human customs, which would be quite embarrassing if they fell into the wrong hands. Embarrassing how? Well, for instance, I have a detailed analysis of why humans seem to find it necessary to discuss weather when they have nothing else to say. My current theory involves primitive atmospheric anxiety combined with social obligation protocols. That's actually not entirely inaccurate. I also have extensive notes about human facial expressions, though I admit most of my research has been conducted through security footage and diplomatic recordings. It's fascinating how much information you convey without words. Marcus found himself studying her mask with new curiosity. Don't Altarians use facial expressions? We do, but differently. Much of our communication is. She paused, seeming to search for the right words, more subtle than human expressions. We rely heavily on micro-movements and energy field fluctuations that probably aren't visible to human perception. Energy field fluctuations. Natural bioelectric emanations. All Altarians generate them, though the patterns are unique to each individual. It's rather like having a constantly shifting emotional signature that others can read. That sounds simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. Imagine never being able to hide what you're really thinking. Indeed. Privacy becomes a very different concept when your mood is literally radiating from your body. She gestured toward a nearby lounge area. Would you like to continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable? Unless you enjoy standing in corridors that curve 17 times for no apparent reason. The lounge turned out to be one of the station's better designed spaces, with comfortable seating arranged around a large viewport that offered a spectacular view of the Kepler Nebula. Marcus settled into a chair that appeared to be made from some kind of adapted material that molded itself to his exact specifications, which was either very advanced technology or mildly concerning alien biology. This is much better, Lyraliai said, taking the seat across from him. Though I should warn you that this furniture is slightly telepathic. Slightly telepathic. It reads basic comfort preferences and adjusts accordingly. Nothing invasive, just temperature, firmness, that sort of thing. Though apparently it sometimes picks up stray thoughts about food preferences. Last week Ambassador Vorthak from the Rigel system sat here and the chair began dispensing what appeared to be fermented algae snacks. Please tell me you're joking. About the algae? Unfortunately not. About the telepathy? Well, that's classified. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, wondering what exactly his chair might be learning about him. Speaking of classified, I have to ask about the mask. Is it really a cultural requirement, or is there something more interesting going on? For a moment, Lyraliai was completely still. Then she laughed, but it sounded slightly forced. Cultural requirement, definitely. Ancient traditions about maintaining formal dignity during diplomatic proceedings. Very serious, very important, completely non-negotiable according to the Council. The Council sounds like fun at parties. Altarian parties are quite different from human gatherings. We tend to focus more on harmonic resonance and synchronized bioluminescence displays. Synchronized bioluminescence. Think of it as coordinated mood lighting, but generated internally. Very beautiful, though it does make it difficult to lie about whether you're enjoying yourself. Marcus leaned back in his surprisingly comfortable chair, watching the nebula swirl outside the viewport. You know, for all the diplomatic complexity and cultural differences, this is probably the most normal conversation I've had in weeks. Normal? Well, relatively speaking. Yesterday I spent 3 hours explaining to Ambassador Kresh why humans don't photosynthesize, and then another hour convincing him that our skin color variations aren't indicators of different subspecies. The day before that, I had to mediate a dispute between two Andromedan delegates about whether Earth's gravity was aggressively oppressive or merely moderately hostile. What was the final verdict? Moderately hostile, with a formal complaint filed about our excessive atmospheric density. Apparently we're considered a heavy world species by galactic standards. To be fair, I've noticed the gravity here is quite noticeable. It takes some adjustment. Marcus studied her posture, realizing for the first time that she moved with the careful deliberation of someone compensating for unfamiliar physical conditions. Is it difficult? The gravity, I mean. Not difficult, exactly. More like wearing slightly heavy clothing all the time. You adjust, but you're always aware of it. She shifted in her chair, and the movement seemed more calculated than natural. Altarians evolved in a lower gravity environment. We're built for grace and efficiency rather than raw strength. That explains the way you move. I was wondering if all diplomats received the same training in elegant deportment. Elegant deportment? You make walking look like an art form. Another pause, and this time Marcus was certain he'd said something wrong. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable before Lyralii spoke again. That's very kind of you to say. I've been working hard to adapt to human environmental standards. Well, you're succeeding admirably. In fact, if I didn't know you were Altarian, I'd probably assume you were just another human diplomat with exceptionally good posture and a flair for dramatic accessories. The moment the words left his mouth, Marcus realized they might have been tactless. But instead of taking offense, Lyralii seemed to relax slightly. Another human diplomat, she repeated. That's quite a compliment, considering how effectively your species has mastered the art of civilized discourse. Have you met many humans before this assignment? A few, during preliminary negotiations. But most of my knowledge comes from cultural databases and observation. Direct interaction is, relatively new for me. How are we measuring up to expectations? Much more complex than the databases suggested. The information indicated that humans were primarily logic-driven with predictable emotional responses. The reality is considerably more interesting. Interesting how? Well, for instance, you just spent considerable time and effort returning a data pad you could have simply transmitted back through official channels. The logical approach would have been more efficient, but the personal approach was more meaningful. Marcus felt heat rising in his cheeks. I was just being polite. Of course, Lyralii said, and there was definitely amusement in her voice. Purely diplomatic courtesy. Exactly. Which explains why you're currently radiating what my biofield sensors would classify as pleased embarrassment mixed with hopeful interest. Your biofield sensors. Part of the mask's functionality. It helps me interpret human emotional states since I can't rely on natural Altarian perception in cross-species interactions. Marcus stared at her, processing this information. So you've been reading my emotions this entire time? Only the obvious ones. The technology isn't invasive, just interpretive. Like having subtitles for feelings. That's either very helpful or completely mortifying. Currently registering as mortified curiosity with undertones of fascinated concern. Stop reading my emotions. I'm afraid that's not entirely possible. The sensors are passive systems, they don't turn off. Though if it helps, human emotions are quite pleasant to observe. Much more dynamic than most species. Marcus buried his face in his hands. This is definitely the strangest diplomatic relationship I've ever been part of. Relationship? The word carried a weight that made him look up sharply. Professional relationship, he clarified quickly. Diplomatic professional relationship. Between a human xenobiologist and an Altarian ambassador. Completely professional. Of course, Lyralii said, and though he couldn't see her expression, something in her posture suggested she was smiling. Completely professional. 3 weeks later, Marcus was beginning to suspect that his definition of completely professional might need some revision. This suspicion was reinforced when he found himself spending his lunch breaks in the observation deck specifically because Lyralia had mentioned enjoying the view of the Kepler Nebula, and further confirmed when he realized he'd started timing his lab work to coincide with her daily diplomatic rounds. Dar. Chen, you're developing what Chief Rodriguez would call behavioral patterns, he muttered to himself while pretending to review atmospheric compatibility data for the 15th time that morning. Next you'll be memorizing her schedule and finding excuses to bump into her in corridors. His communication terminal chimed with an incoming priority message from the station's administrative AI, Dr. Chen, your presence is requested in conference room 7 for an emergency session regarding interspecies diplomatic protocols. Please bring all relevant xenobiological documentation and your sense of humor, as Ambassador Vorthak has apparently declared war on the coffee replicator. Marcus sighed and gathered his research tablets, wondering how exactly one declared war on kitchen appliances and whether this fell under his job description as a xenobiologist. The corridor leading to conference room 7 was filled with the sound of what could generously be described as aggressive diplomatic discussion, punctuated by mechanical whirring that suggested the coffee replicator was fighting back. Inside the conference room, he found a scene that perfectly encapsulated the challenges of interspecies cooperation. Ambassador Vorthak, an imposing figure from the Rigel system whose species resembled what would happen if someone crossed a bear with a particularly militant philosopher, was engaged in what appeared to be a heated debate with a wall-mounted beverage dispenser. Ambassador Lyralia stood nearby, her masked face turned toward the viewport in what Marcus had learned to recognize as her trying not to laugh posture. The machine continues to produce liquid that tastes of industrial lubricant and despair. Vorthak was saying, gesturing dramatically at the offending replicator. This is clearly a deliberate insult to Rigelian dietary sensibilities. Ambassador Vorthak, Marcus said carefully, the replicator has been malfunctioning for weeks. It's not personal. Not personal. Yesterday it produced a beverage that tasted exactly like my ex-mate's cooking. That level of specific insult requires deliberate programming. Lyralia turned from the viewport, and Marcus caught the subtle movement that he'd learned indicated barely contained amusement. Perhaps we could discuss alternative refreshment options. The Altarian delegation has access to portable nutrition systems that might be more compatible with Rigelian biochemistry. Portable nutrition systems that taste like purple, Marcus added helpfully. Everything tastes like purple, Lyralia confirmed. But it's a pleasant purple. I do not understand this human obsession with assigning flavors to colors, Vorthak grumbled, but he moved away from the replicator with the air of someone declaring a temporary ceasefire. It's not just humans, Marcus said. The Centaurian delegation yesterday described their atmospheric supplements as tasting angular with hints of temporal displacement. Temporal displacement has a flavor? Lyralia asked. Apparently it's similar to what humans would call nostalgic regret with undertones of might have been. Vorthak settled into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight. This is why the Rigel system maintains that interspecies cooperation is fundamentally impossible. We cannot even agree on basic sensory descriptions, much less complex diplomatic protocols. Actually, Marcus said, consulting his research tablets, I've been working on a comprehensive analysis of cross-species sensory translation. The preliminary results suggest that most species share common baseline experiences, but describe them using culturally specific metaphors. Meaning? Vorthak asked. Meaning that when Centaurians describe something as angular, they're probably referring to the same sensation that humans would call sharp or acidic. The underlying experience is similar, but the descriptive framework is different. Lyralia leaned forward with obvious interest. Have you tested this theory? Not extensively, but I've been collecting sensory descriptions from various species and looking for patterns. For instance, every species that's tried Earth coffee has described it using metaphors related to bitterness, energy, and morning awakening, even though their specific terminology varies wildly. The Andromedan delegates called it liquid motivation with aggressive clarity, Lyralia added. Which is actually quite accurate. See Universal Concepts, Species-Specific Vocabulary. Marcus pulled up a data display showing his preliminary correlation charts. I think this could be the key to improving interspecies communication protocols. Vorthak studied the charts with the expression of someone discovering that his fundamental worldview might require adjustment. This suggests that our differences are primarily linguistic rather than experiential. Exactly. Which means that most diplomatic misunderstandings might be simple translation errors rather than irreconcilable cultural gaps. Dr. Chen, Lyralii said, and there was something in her voice that made him look up sharply, this research could change everything about how species interact with each other. It's just preliminary data, Marcus said, but he felt a flush of pride at her obvious enthusiasm. I'd need much more extensive testing to prove the theory. What kind of testing? Vorthak asked. Ideally, controlled sensory experiences with multiple species, cross-referenced with cultural context analysis and neurological response mapping. Basically, a comprehensive study of how different brains process similar stimuli. The Council would be very interested in this research, Lyralii said. Both the Altarian Science Directorate and the Human Diplomatic Corps have been struggling with communication barriers for months. You really think it could help? Dr. Chen, if you can prove that species differences are primarily matters of translation rather than fundamental incompatibility, you could revolutionize galactic diplomacy. Marcus felt the familiar warmth that came from Lyralii's approval, followed immediately by the equally familiar confusion about why her opinion mattered so much to him. I'd be happy to present my findings to the Council. Excellent, Vorthak said, rising from his protesting chair. Though I still maintain that the coffee replicator has developed personal animosity toward me specifically. After Vorthak left, Marcus found himself alone with Lyralii in the conference room, surrounded by the gentle hum of the station's life support systems and the distant sound of the coffee replicator apparently attempting to achieve sentience through sheer mechanical spite. Your research really is remarkable, Lyralii said, moving to study his data displays more closely. I've been working on similar problems from the diplomatic side, but approaching it through xenobiology is inspired. Similar problems? Communication barriers, cultural misunderstandings, the general challenge of building trust between species that evolved under completely different conditions. She paused, her masked face turned toward the data. It's more difficult than most people realize. Trust is always difficult, Marcus said. Even between humans. We're constantly misinterpreting each other's intentions and motivations. But humans share the same basic biology, the same sensory experiences, the same evolutionary background. When species are fundamentally different. She trailed off, her posture shifting in a way that suggested discomfort. Different how? Physical differences, cultural differences, the constant awareness that you might be accidentally giving offense or misunderstanding critical social cues. Her voice carried a weight that seemed personal rather than theoretical. Sometimes it feels like you're performing a role that doesn't quite fit, hoping no one notices the discrepancies. Marcus studied her carefully, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands had curled slightly in her lap. That sounds exhausting. It can be. Though it's worth it when you find someone who makes the effort to understand, who doesn't judge based on preconceptions or superficial differences. Someone like who? Lyralii turned toward him, and even through the mask he could sense her focus. Someone like you, Dr. Chen. You've never once treated me as anything other than exactly who I am. Who you are is fascinating, Marcus said before he could stop himself. Intelligent, funny, dedicated to building bridges between species that have never had any reason to trust each other. Why wouldn't I treat you with respect? Because. She began, then stopped. Because not everyone is capable of looking past surface differences to see the person underneath. Their loss. Is it? Or is it natural caution? Most species are suspicious of anything that seems too different, too foreign. It's a survival instinct. Marcus moved closer, noting how she didn't step back. Maybe. But some things are worth overcoming instinct for. What things? Connection. Understanding. The possibility that someone different might teach you something you never knew you needed to learn. And what have I taught you, Dr. Chen? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that Marcus wasn't entirely ready to examine. You've taught me that diplomacy isn't just about protocols and procedures. It's about being brave enough to trust someone even when you can't predict how they'll respond. Trust, Lyralii repeated softly. Yes, that's exactly what it is. Do you trust me? The silence stretched long enough that Marcus began to worry he'd overstepped some invisible boundary. Then Lyralii nodded slowly. I do, she said. More than I probably should, considering the circumstances. What circumstances? The fact that everything about this situation is more complicated than it appears. Before Marcus could ask what she meant, his communication terminal chimed with another priority message. All senior staff report to the main conference hall immediately. We have a situation developing with the hardline human delegation that requires immediate attention. Lyralii straightened, her diplomatic composure sliding back into place like armor. Duty calls. Unfortunately. But Lyralii. He paused, realizing he'd used her first name without the formal title for the first time. This conversation isn't finished. No, she said, and there was something almost like regret in her voice. I don't believe it is. The main conference hall buzzed with the kind of tension that suggested someone had either discovered a critical system failure or accidentally started an interstellar incident. Marcus arrived to find the usual suspects gathered around the central holographic display. Chief Engineer Rodriguez looking like she hadn't slept in 3 days, Station Commander Okafor wearing his diplomatic crisis management expression, and a cluster of human delegates who appeared to be in various stages of indignation. Ah, Dr. Chen, Commander Okafor said as Marcus entered. Perfect timing. We need your expertise on xenobiological authentication protocols. Authentication protocols. Someone has raised concerns about the legitimacy of our Altarian delegation, said Delegate Harrison, a thin man whose perpetual expression suggested he found the entire universe personally disappointing. Specifically, questions about whether Ambassador Lyralii is actually who she claims to be. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest extensive holographic modification and possible species misrepresentation, Harrison continued, consulting his data pad with obvious satisfaction. We've been analyzing diplomatic footage and have identified several inconsistencies. Inconsistencies like what? Rodriguez stepped forward, pulling up a series of images on the main display. Energy field fluctuations that don't match standard Altarian bioelectric signatures, gravitational compensation patterns that suggest a different body mass than what's visible, and occasional holographic static around her extremities. Marcus stared at the images, his mind racing. There could be dozens of explanations for those readings. Could be, Harrison said. But the simplest explanation is deliberate deception. We need to know exactly who we're negotiating with. Have you discussed this with Ambassador Lyralii? We tried, Commander Okafor said. She's requested time to consult with the Altarian Council before responding to our concerns. Which, frankly, has only increased suspicion among certain members of the human delegation. Because nothing says, innocent misunderstanding, like emergency consultations with your home government, Harrison added dryly. Maybe she's just being careful, Marcus said, knowing it sounded weak even as he said it. Diplomatic protocols can be complex. Dr. Chen, Okafor said carefully, you've spent more time with Ambassador Lyralii than anyone else on the station. Have you noticed anything unusual about her behavior or appearance? The question hung in the air like a trap. Marcus thought about the way Lyralii moved with careful deliberation, her reluctance to discuss certain aspects of Altarian culture, the mask she never removed, and most importantly, the trust she'd said she placed in him despite circumstances being more complicated than they appeared. Nothing that couldn't be explained by cultural differences and the challenges of operating in an unfamiliar environment, he said finally. Harrison's expression suggested he'd expected as much. Of course. Though I suppose we should also consider the possibility that Dr. Chen's judgment might be compromised by personal feelings. Excuse me. It's quite obvious that you've developed an attachment to the ambassador. Understandable, given her apparent charm, but hardly conducive to objective analysis. Marcus felt heat rising in his cheeks. My professional assessment is based on scientific observation and xenobiological expertise, not personal feelings. I'm sure it is, Harrison said in a tone that suggested the opposite. Enough, Commander Okafor said firmly. Delegate Harrison, your concerns have been noted and will be addressed through proper diplomatic channels. Dr. Chen, I need you to review all available data on Altarian bioelectric signatures and provide a comprehensive analysis of any anomalies in Ambassador Lyraliai's readings. Sir, I should point out that my analysis will be based on limited baseline data. We don't have extensive information about individual variations in Altarian biology. Do your best with what we have. And Dr. Chen. This analysis needs to be completely objective. I know you respect the ambassador, but the integrity of these negotiations depends on everyone being exactly who they claim to be. As the meeting disbanded, Marcus found himself walking back to his lab with the uncomfortable feeling that his carefully ordered world was about to become significantly more complicated. The data Rodriguez had shown was troubling, not because it proved deception, but because it raised questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. His lab felt different somehow, as if the space had been contaminated by suspicion. Marcus pulled up the bioelectric readings on his main display and began the tedious process of comparing them to the limited Altarian baseline data in the station's xenobiological database. 3 hours later, he had to admit that Harrison's concerns weren't entirely without merit. The readings were unusual, though not impossible. The gravitational compensation pattern suggested someone who was either significantly lighter or significantly denser than they appeared. The energy field fluctuations were inconsistent with typical Altarian signatures, but they could indicate individual variation, medical devices, or any number of technological augmentations. Inconclusive, he muttered to his computer screen. Suspicious if you're looking for reasons to be suspicious, explainable if you're inclined to trust. His door chimed, and Marcus looked up to see Lyralii standing in the doorway. Without the usual diplomatic bustle of the corridors, she seemed smaller somehow, less imposing. The ornate mask caught the light as always, but now Marcus found himself studying it with uncomfortable intensity. I heard about the meeting, she said, stepping into the lab. I wanted to explain. Explain what? Why I can't simply submit to their authentication demands. She moved to the chair across from his desk but didn't sit. It's more complicated than they realize. Harrison thinks you're not who you claim to be. Harrison thinks a lot of things, most of them uncharitable. There was an edge to her voice that Marcus hadn't heard before. But in this case, his suspicion isn't entirely wrong. Marcus felt his heart skip. What do you mean? I mean that I'm not presenting myself entirely naturally. Are you Altarian? Yes, absolutely. But there are aspects of my appearance that I've been modifying for diplomatic purposes. What kind of modifications? Lyralii was silent for a long moment, her masked face turned toward the viewport. The kind that seemed necessary to build trust with a species known for being suspicious of significant physical differences. Physical differences like what? Nothing dramatic. Nothing that changes who I am or affects my ability to represent my people. Just cosmetic adjustments to make interspecies interaction more comfortable for everyone involved. Marcus studied her carefully, noting the tension in her posture and the way her hands had clenched in her lap. Is that why you wear the mask? Partly. Though the mask serves multiple purposes. Including hiding whatever you don't want me to see. Including protecting both of us from complications that neither of us is prepared to handle. The words hung between them, loaded with implications that Marcus wasn't sure he wanted to explore. What complications? The kind that arise when personal feelings intersect with diplomatic necessities. She finally sat down, her movements careful and deliberate. The kind that make objective analysis impossible. Harrison was right, then. About my judgment being compromised. Harrison was right about your feelings, not about their impact on your judgment. You've been scrupulously fair in all our interactions, even when it would have been easier to simply accept everything at face value. But I haven't been objective. No, I said softly. Neither have I. Marcus leaned back in his chair, trying to process what she was telling him. So what happens now? Do you submit to authentication protocols, or do we continue this diplomatic dance while everyone assumes the worst? I don't know. The council is divided on how to proceed. Some believe that transparency is essential for building lasting trust. Others worry that human reactions to physical differences might derail negotiations entirely. What do you believe? I believe that trust requires honesty, but I also believe that some truths are harder to accept than others. Try me. Dr. Chen. Marcus. If we're talking about personal feelings and diplomatic complications, I think we can dispense with formal titles. Marcus, she repeated, and something in the way she said his name made him want to hear it again. What if the truth changes everything? What if what you see doesn't match what you've imagined? What if it doesn't? What if the truth is that I care more about who you are than what you look like? You say that now. I mean it now. I stood abruptly, pacing to the viewport. The modifications I'm using aren't just cosmetic. They're extensive. Designed to address fundamental compatibility issues between Altarian and human interaction protocols. Such as visual processing differences, environmental adaptation requirements, social signaling incompatibilities. She paused, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. The fear that first impressions might override rational judgment. Marcus joined her at the viewport, noting how she didn't step away when he moved closer. I've spent weeks getting to know your mind, your sense of humor, your dedication to building bridges between species that have every reason to mistrust each other. Whatever physical differences you're worried about aren't going to change any of that. You're very certain. I'm certain about what matters to me. She turned to face him, and even through the mask he could sense her studying his expression. And if the council decides that full transparency is necessary? If the authentication protocols require me to remove all technological modifications? Then I'll be there to remind everyone that diplomatic negotiations should be based on competence and good faith, not on whether someone meets arbitrary standards of physical familiarity. Even if it means defending me against your own species. Especially then. I reached up toward her mask, her fingers hovering near the ornate fastenings. For a moment, Marcus thought she might actually remove it. Then her hand dropped back to her side. Not yet, she said. Not until I know for certain that it won't destroy everything we've been working toward. It won't, Marcus said, surprised by his own certainty. I hope you're right, I said. Because I'm rapidly running out of alternatives. The next morning brought what Chief Engineer Rodriguez cheerfully described as a cascading series of technological failures that would be hilarious if they weren't potentially catastrophic. Marcus discovered this when his alarm failed to activate, his coffee replicator produced something that resembled motor oil mixed with regret, and his lab's main computer began displaying alt text in what appeared to be ancient Centaurian poetry. The station's AI is having what I can only describe as an artistic breakdown, Rodriguez explained when Marcus finally made it to the engineering section. It started at 0300 hours with the lighting systems deciding to create mood ambience in the corridors, escalated to the atmospheric recyclers humming show tunes, and reached peak chaos when the gravity regulators began fluctuating in rhythm with whatever song they're apparently composing. Song. Listen carefully to the hum of the life support systems. I swear it's trying to achieve harmony. Marcus paused, focusing on the background noise that was usually easy to ignore. After a moment, he had to admit that there did seem to be an oddly musical quality to the mechanical sounds. Is this dangerous? Probably not immediately fatal, but it's playing havoc with our more sensitive systems. including the holographic projection networks and bioelectric monitoring arrays. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's fluctuating environmental controls. The holographic networks. Everything from the diplomatic quarters privacy screens to the recreational holodecks. The whole system's been cycling between full function and complete failure for the past 6 hours. Have you told Commander Okafor? He's aware. In fact, he's called an emergency session for all senior staff and diplomatic personnel. Apparently we need to address both the technical failures and their potential impact on ongoing negotiations. The main conference hall was in a state of barely controlled chaos when Marcus arrived. The holographic display system was cycling through a random selection of images ranging from stellar cartography charts to what appeared to be abstract art generated by the station's malfunctioning AI. Commander Okafor stood at the center of it all, looking like a man who had decided that if the universe insisted on being unreasonable, he would meet it with grim professionalism. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted sentient beings, Okafor began, raising his voice over the sound of the ventilation system attempting what might generously be called a musical interlude. We have a situation. Delegate Harrison, who had apparently decided that technical difficulties were somehow personally offensive, gestured dramatically at the flickering displays. Commander, this level of system instability raises serious questions about the station's ability to maintain security protocols. How can we be certain that sensitive diplomatic communications haven't been compromised? The failures appear to be confined to non-essential entertainment and comfort systems, Rodriguez said. Core life support, communications, and security remain stable. Non-essential. Ambassador Vorthak rumbled from his position near the back of the room. The replicator in my quarters has been producing beverages that taste like existential uncertainty with hints of mechanical despair for the past 4 hours. That's actually an improvement over yesterday's industrial lubricant and sadness, Marcus pointed out. This is hardly the time for humor, Dr. Chen, Harrison said sharply. We're dealing with potential security breaches and diplomatic complications. What diplomatic complications? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. The holographic monitoring systems have been malfunctioning, Okafor explained. Which means any technological modifications or augmentations that our guests might be using could become visible during system fluctuations. Marcus looked around the room, noting that Ambassador Lyralii was conspicuously absent. Has anyone experienced unexpected revelations due to these malfunctions? Not yet, Okafor said carefully. But several delegates have requested temporary quarters adjustments to avoid potential exposure of personal technologies or medical devices. Medical devices, Harrison repeated with obvious skepticism. How convenient. Delegate Harrison, said a voice from the doorway, I'm curious about your definition of convenience. Everyone turned to see Ambassador Lyralii entering the conference hall, her ornate mask catching the erratic lighting in ways that seemed almost deliberately dramatic. Marcus noted immediately that something was different about her posture, a tension that suggested someone who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to live with the consequences. Ambassador, Okafor said. We were just discussing the station's technical difficulties and their potential impact on diplomatic protocols. I'm aware, Lyralii said, moving to take her usual position near the main display. In fact, I've come to address those concerns directly. How so? Harrison asked. By eliminating the need for speculation about technological modifications and their purposes. She reached up toward her mask, her fingers hovering near the ornate fastenings. The Altarian Council has decided that full transparency is preferable to continued suspicion and diplomatic uncertainty. Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate. Lyralii, you don't have to. Actually, I do. She turned toward him, and even through the mask he could sense her focus. Trust requires honesty, as you pointed out. And honesty requires courage. Ambassador, Commander Okafor said carefully, are you certain this is the appropriate venue for revealing that I've been using holographic modifications to appear more conventionally human-like? For admitting that my species' actual appearance differs from what you've been seeing? For acknowledging that diplomatic necessity sometimes requires creative interpretation of visual presentation. The room fell silent except for the continued musical humming of the life support systems, which had apparently decided that this moment called for something resembling a dramatic orchestral crescendo. The modifications, Lyralii continued, were designed to address compatibility issues and reduce potential negative reactions to physical differences. Nothing more dramatic than that. What kind of physical differences? Harrison asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone who suspected his worst assumptions were about to be confirmed. The kind that don't affect my ability to represent my people or negotiate in good faith, but might distract from the substance of our discussions. Her hands moved to the mask's fastenings again. The kind that shouldn't matter, but historically have proven problematic in first contact situations. Marcus stepped forward. Lyralii, whatever you're worried about, I meant what I said yesterday. Physical differences don't change who you are. Thank you, she said softly. I hope everyone else feels the same way. The mask's fastenings released with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Lyralii hesitated for just a moment, then lifted the ornate covering away from her face. The reaction was immediate and varied. Ambassador Vorthak made a sound that might have been surprise or approval. Harrison stepped backward as if he'd been physically struck. Rodriguez whistled low under her breath. Commander Okafor maintained his professional composure with visible effort. Marcus found himself staring at a face that was unmistakably Lyralii's but subtly, definitively different from human features. Her eyes were the same warm brown he'd imagined, her smile exactly as he'd pictured it, but her ears extended upward in elegant points that gave her an otherworldly beauty that was striking rather than alien. Well, she said after a moment of silence, that's what Altarians actually look like. Any questions? That's it? Marcus asked. The big diplomatic secret was pointed ears. Elven-like ears, according to your cultural databases. Apparently humans have strong mythological associations with this particular physical characteristic that have historically led to complicated reactions. Complicated how? Vorthak rumbled with what sounded like amusement. Dr. Chen, your species has extensive fictional literature about pointed-eared beings that ranges from idealized perfection to dangerous otherworldly seducers. The Altarian diplomatic corps was concerned about triggering inappropriate mythological associations. So you've been wearing a mask and using holographic modifications because you were worried we'd think you were an elf. When you put it like that, Lyralii said, it does sound rather silly. It sounds ridiculous, Marcus said, moving closer to get a better look at her actual features. You've been hiding one of the most beautiful faces I've ever seen because you were worried about fairy tale associations. Beautiful? Lyralii asked, and there was something vulnerable in her voice that made Marcus realize how much courage this revelation had required. Stunning, he said firmly. Absolutely stunning. Dr. Chen, Harrison interrupted, while your personal aesthetic preferences are no doubt fascinating, we need to address the broader implications of this deception. What deception? Marcus asked, not taking his eyes off Lyralii's face. She's exactly who she said she was. She's Altarian, she's a legitimate ambassador, and she's been working in good faith to build cooperation between our species. The fact that she used cosmetic modifications to avoid triggering our ridiculous mythological prejudices seems like reasonable diplomatic strategy, not deception. Reasonable diplomatic strategy, Okafor repeated thoughtfully. I have to say, Ambassador, your concerns about human reactions weren't entirely unfounded. We do have some rather specific cultural associations with pointed ears. Most of them positive, actually, Rodriguez added. Elves are generally portrayed as wise, magical, and extremely attractive in human fiction. And therein lies the problem, Lyralii said. Diplomatic relationships based on mythological idealization are just as problematic as those based on fear or suspicion. So you decided to be practical about it, Marcus said. Smart. Was it? I've spent weeks building relationships under false pretenses, worrying constantly about exposure, and questioning whether any trust one earned was real or based on artificial presentation. The trust was real, Marcus said firmly. Everything about our interactions was based on who you are, not what you look like. The modifications were just diplomatic makeup. Diplomatic makeup, Lyraeli repeated, and for the first time since removing her mask, she smiled. I rather like that description. So do I, Okafor said. Ambassador, thank you for your honesty. I think we can all agree that this revelation doesn't change the substance of our negotiations. Agreed, Vorthak rumbled. Though I have to say, the pointed ears suit you. Very dignified. Thank you, Lyraeli said. Though I have to admit, it feels strange to be having this conversation without technological intermediation. Strange good or strange bad? Marcus asked. Strange liberating, she said, and her smile broadened. I'd forgotten how much energy it takes to maintain constant artificial modifications. Well, Harrison said stiffly, I suppose this resolves the authentication question. Though I maintain that full disclosure from the beginning would have been preferable. Noted, Lyraeli said dryly. I'll be sure to include that feedback in my report to the council. As the meeting disbanded and the various delegates filed out, Marcus found himself alone with Lyraeli in the conference room. She was still holding her mask, turning it over in her hands as if uncertain what to do with it now that it was no longer necessary. So, Marcus said, how does it feel to be yourself? Terrifying and wonderful in approximately equal measure, she said. Though I have to admit, the reactions were better than I'd feared. Were you really worried about mythological associations? Among other things. First contact situations are delicate, and physical appearance can trigger unexpected psychological responses. Better to establish trust and compatibility before introducing variables that might complicate rational discussion. And now? Now I get to find out whether the person you've been getting to know was real or just an elaborate diplomatic performance. Marcus moved closer, noting how much more expressive her face was without the mask. There's only one way to find out. Which is? Give me a chance to get to know the real you. Marcus, she said, and the way she said his name sent warmth spreading through his chest, I'd like that very much. 2 months later, Marcus stood in his lab reviewing the final draft of his comprehensive report on interspecies sensory translation protocols, a document that had grown from idle curiosity into what the Galactic Diplomatic Corps was calling, potentially the most important breakthrough in cross-species communication since the invention of universal translators. The irony wasn't lost on him that his most significant scientific achievement had grown directly from trying to understand why everyone described coffee differently. Dr. Chen, came a familiar voice from his doorway, I hope I'm not interrupting anything crucial. Marcus looked up to see Lyraeli entering his lab, her pointed ears catching the light in a way that still made him momentarily forget whatever he'd been thinking about. 3 weeks of seeing her actual face hadn't diminished the effect, if anything, it had intensified it. Ambassador, he said, grinning. Just reviewing the final edits on the translation protocols paper. Though I have to say, your contributions to the research have been invaluable. My contributions consisted mainly of describing how things taste like colors and explaining why Altarian humor doesn't translate well into human conceptual frameworks. Your contributions, Marcus corrected, included insights into bioelectric communication, cultural context analysis, and the theoretical framework for emotional resonance mapping. Also, you helped me realize that the Centaurian delegates weren't being deliberately obscure when they described the coffee as angular, they literally perceived sharp flavors as geometric shapes. Lyraeli settled into what had become her usual chair, the one that had initially been slightly telepathic but had apparently decided to behave normally once the station's AI had recovered from its artistic phase. Have you heard back from the review board? This morning. Full approval for implementation across all diplomatic stations, with a request to expand the research to include non-humanoid species. Marcus leaned back in his chair, still somewhat amazed by how dramatically his life had changed. They're also fast-tracking the establishment of permanent xenobiological research positions at major diplomatic facilities. Congratulations. Though I suppose this means you'll be leaving Harmony Station? Actually, no. I've been offered the position of Chief Xenobiological Consultant for the Kepler sector, based right here. Apparently they've decided that having someone who understands both the science and the practical applications of interspecies communication is too valuable to relocate. I'm glad, Lyralii said, and something in her voice made him look at her more carefully. You sound like someone who has news of her own. I do. The Altarian Council has officially appointed me as permanent ambassador to the human territories, with a mandate to establish long-term cooperative protocols between our species. Marcus felt a surge of happiness that surprised him with its intensity. That's wonderful. Congratulations. Thank you. Though I have to admit, the appointment comes with some interesting challenges. Such as the fact that permanent diplomatic positions require extensive cultural integration protocols. I'll need to develop a much deeper understanding of human social customs, recreational activities, and interpersonal relationship structures. That sounds like a significant research project. It is. In fact, I was hoping to find someone willing to serve as a cultural liaison and integration specialist. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Anyone particular in mind? Well, I was thinking someone with extensive experience in cross-species communication, a demonstrated ability to see past surface differences to understand underlying compatibility, and preferably someone who thinks pointed ears are attractive rather than mythologically problematic. That's quite a specific job description. I believe in being thorough. Marcus stood and moved around his desk, noting how Lyralii's eyes tracked his movement with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. What exactly would this cultural liaison position entail? Extensive one-on-one consultation sessions, regular recreational activities designed to promote understanding of human social customs, and probably a great deal of what humans call quality time. Quality time. I'm told it's essential for proper cultural integration. Marcus stopped in front of her chair, close enough that he could see the amused sparkle in her eyes. And this would be a purely professional arrangement? Absolutely. Though I understand that human cultural integration sometimes involves what your databases describe as romantic partnerships for the purposes of deepening emotional and social understanding. Romantic partnerships. For research purposes, naturally. Naturally. Lyralii stood, bringing them close enough that Marcus could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Dr. Chen, would you be interested in accepting this position? Ambassador, Marcus said, reaching up to gently touch one of her pointed ears, I can't think of anything I'd rather do. Excellent, she said, leaning into his touch. Though I should warn you that Altarian research methods can be quite thorough. I'm counting on it. When they kissed, Marcus discovered that Lyralii had been wrong about one thing: Altarian emotional resonance was perfectly compatible with human sensory experience. In fact, it was considerably more intense than anything he'd previously imagined possible. Interesting, Lyralii murmured against his lips. My bioelectric sensors are registering completely unprecedented readings. Good unprecedented or concerning unprecedented? Definitely good. Though I think we'll need extensive additional research to fully understand the phenomenon. I volunteer for all necessary experimental protocols. I was hoping you'd say that. 6 months later, the Harmony Station coffee replicator was producing beverages that actually resembled coffee. The station's AI had abandoned its musical ambitions in favor of writing poetry about the beauty of functional life support systems, and Marcus's research on interspecies communication had been implemented at diplomatic facilities throughout the galaxy. Ambassador Vorthak had successfully negotiated a trade agreement that provided Rigelian colonies with coffee that didn't taste like industrial lubricant, in exchange for atmospheric processing technology that made station life significantly more comfortable for everyone involved. The Centaurian delegation had contributed architectural improvements that reduced corridor-related confusion by limiting curves to a mere 7 per pathway instead of 17. Delegate Harrison had been reassigned to a position more suited to his talents, which primarily involved filing reports about other people's diplomatic successes and complaining about them in precisely organized detail. You know, Marcus said one evening as he and Lyralii watched the Kepler Nebula swirl outside the observation deck viewport, 6 months ago I was convinced that the most dangerous thing about working on a space station was explosive decompression. And now I know it's falling in love with someone whose job description includes permanent cultural integration specialist. Lyrally I laughed, the sound echoing softly in the observation lounge. Dangerous how? Completely life-altering in the most wonderful possible way. I'll take that as a compliment. You should. Though I have to ask, what would have happened if I'd reacted badly when you removed your mask? Honestly, I probably would have requested immediate reassignment and spent the rest of my diplomatic career avoiding human territories. And now I'm planning to spend the rest of my diplomatic career studying human cultural integration with one particular human who makes everything else seem secondary by comparison. Marcus pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side. For the record, I still think the pointed ears are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Even though they're not mythologically accurate according to human folklore. Especially because they're not mythologically accurate. They're real, they're yours, and they're perfect exactly as they are. Marcus? Yes. I love you too. Outside the viewport, the Kepler Nebula continued its eternal dance of light and cosmic dust, while inside the station, two species who had never had any reason to trust each other continued the more challenging and infinitely more rewarding work of building something entirely new together. And in the distance, the coffee replicator hummed contentedly to itself, finally producing beverages that everyone agreed tasted exactly like what coffee was supposed to taste like, regardless of their species' particular sensory metaphors. Which was, Marcus reflected, probably the most diplomatic achievement of all.